And thank you to the accomplished, dedicated, and very inspiring women who are all speaking today. My name is Erica Levinson. I'm a graduate student in International Affairs and Development at the New School, and I will be moderating this panel. We're privileged to have 4 speakers who are some of the leading activists and voices in these spaces and have been for several decades. We have Ms. Susana Malcorra, who is the former Minister of Foreign Affairs and Worship for Argentina from 2015 to 2017, former Chief of Staff of the Secretary General of the United Nations, and member and co-founder of GWL Voices. We have Ms. Miriam Mazaquiza Jerez, a Quichua woman from Ecuador, who is a Social Affairs Officer at UNDESA, former advisor to the Ministry of Cultural and National Heritage in Ecuador, and former fellow in the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights Indigenous Fellowship Program. We also have Ms. Melanne Verveer, who is the Executive Director of the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security, co-founder of Seneca Women, former U.S. Ambassador at Large for Global Women's Issues, and member of GWL Voices. And last but not least, we have Ms. Fatiha Serour, who is the Justice Impact Lab co-founder, former Deputy Special Representative and Assistant Secretary General in Somalia, international human rights expert for the Africa Group for Justice and Accountability, and member of GWL Voices. Please join me in giving a big round of applause for the speakers. Today's panel is one of several side events to the United Nations General Assembly that GWL Voices is organizing on a range of topics from gender-based violence to UN reform, the Our Common Agenda process, and feminist foreign policy. To give opening remarks, we have Ms. Monica Aliman, who is the International Program Director for Gender, Racial, and Ethnic Justice at the Ford Foundation, who I'll give the floor to now. Thank you, Ms. Aliman.
Thank you very much for making it to this space. The group of women leaders is a key partner of our program, and the hope is that through this partnership that we will be able to expand the voices and leadership of women in conversations that are essential at the UN level. But this panel is about more than that. This panel is about us thinking about the future and our role in that future, and deciding whether we want that future to be feminist or not. So I invite all of you to engage, to come forward. I know that it's a little bit of an intimate space. That is what it has been during the week, and we think that things are going to start picking up as we go, but things are moving slow right now, and it's understandable because of COVID. So, and we all know that we are not yet over with this pandemic. So I hope that this space makes you feel comfortable and that you know that you can raise your hand, ask questions, and be part of this larger community that we are trying to create. So with that, I will say thank you and welcome to the Ford Foundation.
Thank you, Monica. It's a real pleasure to be here. We as GWL Voices have a lot to thank to the Ford Foundation and to you for the support you have given us in the past years and in the current moment. Welcome, everybody. Friday evening is not an easy time to bring people to these kind of events. We hope to have more people coming, but it's also important to respect time, so that's why we have started. Very briefly, I will describe to you what our GWL Voices is. We started in March 2019. It's over 3 years ago, 3.5 years ago, I will say, my goodness. This was an idea that came from 3 of us, Irina Bokova, Helen Clark, and myself. Some of you may recall the 3 of us competed to be Secretary General of the United Nations. And you all know we all lost. So after that, and we were colleagues and good friends. young competing, which we competed hard too. And we got together and felt that it was important to do something together and to showcase that women can compete hard, but at the same time be ready to work together afterwards and do something of an impact. And the idea was to bring a group of us former senior UN officials or former senior government officials who have worked very closely with the UN. And why was this a condition? Because we felt very strongly that the question of women empowerment was losing ground big time, and that this was associated to the fact that multilateralism was losing ground. We believe still today that since Beijing, it was the pressure, the peer pressure that members felt in CSW every March that allowed for many policies to be enacted because governments didn't want to come to New York and show that they didn't have anything to demonstrate. So a strong UN meant a strong push for women empowerment, and both were debilitated. So that's why we created Global Women Leaders, Voices for Change and Inclusion, to work on those two tracks, women empowerment and multilateralism, the strengthening of multilateralism. We started being a few. Today we are 61 and counting, some 2 or 3 coming our way. We were just a group of people that came together. Now we are a global association of 61 members. We have come a long way. Ford Foundation has helped us a lot in getting here. And we have different lines of work. One of them is gender-based violence, which is the subject of discussion today. I want to thank my colleagues Fatiha and Melanne for being with me in this panel. I also want to thank our good friend from the UN, from DESA, for joining us and bringing another perspective. But in particular, I want to mention our moderator. One of the practices that we have established is that in every event, we have somebody moderating who is from the young generation. I won't say how old we are, but our average age as a group is not low. It's not low. And that means that we need to hear young women telling us how they see issues so that we can use the strength of our voices, of our collective voices, not only to reflect what we believe should be done, but more importantly, to reflect what the younger generation feels that should be done. That's why we always engage, and thank you for joining us, some representative from the young generation in our discussions. This has to be a conversation, so please, as Monica suggested, put forward questions, challenge us, and we hope to really have the opportunity of a great exchange. And with this, I finish. It has been already too long. And thanks again for being here on a Friday. And afterwards, I hope to have the opportunity to mingle and have a more informal conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Malcorra and Ms. Aleman, for those opening remarks. So the beginning of a new United Nations General Assembly is a time of great optimism for many. It's the beginning of a new year, and it comes with a renewed commitment to what can be accomplished in the year ahead. In other words, it brings the promise of a better future. In this event, committed to bettering the lives of women and girls through policy interventions related to gender-based violence, we will explore the current global situation of gender-based violence, highlight good practices and experiences from different actors in addressing this issue, provide insights on how to boost action on gender-based violence by actors at all levels, and address the structural causes of gender-based violence. I think we can all agree that women and girls play an inimitable role in enabling peaceful societies, and the future of women and girls is intimately connected with the fate of the world. Gender-based violence therefore poses a direct threat to our global future because it prevents women from participating in society fully. For anyone doubting just how big of a threat gender-based violence presents, let me give you a few examples of the vital role that women and girls play. Thousands of Indigenous women and girls across the world have dedicated their lives to being land defenders, protecting the world's biodiversity despite enormous resistance from powerful corporations and personal danger to themselves and their communities. We've seen that without them, more fossil fuels are extracted, biodiversity destroyed, and people displaced, thus worsening the climate crisis. At the same time, women and girls also disproportionately carry out unpaid care work that enables the global economy to spin. Without them, the global economy would literally collapse. I certainly don't want to glorify this unpaid work, and I know we all agree that we need to redistribute, reduce, and reward women's unpaid care work, but I digress. The point is that the world would fall apart without women and girls, and it's in all of our interests to protect them. However, at the same time, gender-based violence has increased in recent years, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. 1 in 3 women will experience gender-based violence in their lifetime. This is a conversation that Secretary General Guterres and many others within the UN are aware of and are working on, and that inspired the Our Common Agenda report, as well as the new Agenda for Peace within it. The new Agenda for Peace presents a unique opportunity to globally elevate effective policy interventions, norms, and understandings of gender-based violence, and this panel is driven by the dedication of not only GWL Voices, but also each of the participants individually to contribute to this effort. So against that backdrop, we'll start the panel with 1 question and a 5-minute answer for each speaker, followed by a moderated discussion, and then open the room to Q&A. So I'd like to start by first asking Ms. Malcorra, how can we ensure that gender-based violence is at the center of the new Agenda for Peace?
Well, thank you for that. And I think there is a larger question. Is how do we assure that gender-based violence is at the center of the agenda, period? Not only the Agenda for Peace. Of course, no question about the Agenda for Peace, and we can dwell into that. One of the things we have done as a group is commission a few works to different universities to analyze the problem of gender-based violence from different perspectives. For example, we did something with the University for Peace in Costa Rica. They analyzed the impact of gender-based violence through social media, which is incredibly difficult and challenging. We had some work done in Central America, in El Salvador in particular, to assess what was the impact in the region. We had something done for Africa. But then we had one work commission, which is the one I want to talk about now, addressing your question, which tried to find a correlation between female leadership in governments and the passing of gender-based violence laws that protect and defend women. One will assume that there is a correlation, but we had a very interesting team of a senior researcher and a very young student supporting her to work through this, and you will be able to find this report in our website. I will just briefly summarize to address your question. There's an issue of leadership. There is a clear correlation, and I'm not going to go into the details, but again, you'll find it in the report, that proves that when you have women in leadership in government, there is a much higher chance to have better laws. But what is more important, not only have the laws enacted, but have them followed through, which is the real problem. I mean, not having the law only is making it work. But the interesting thing that this work proved is that, yes, it is important to have senior women in the executive branch, but it's more important to have them in parliament. When you have a good women representation in parliament, the chances that laws will be enacted taking a gender lens and considering a gender perspective are much higher. And the probability that there will be follow through in those laws is much higher. So going back to your question, this does not apply only in the Agenda for Peace, which is a great issue, and Melanne has worked on that deeply. It is a much bigger question. And here I will say, the research also found that there is an uneven distribution of representation in parliament between the developed and the developing world. The developing world tends to have less representation of women, although there are some good examples in the developing world, but they are not the standard. And as I said, there is an important impact of the weight of parliaments having this representation throughout the world. What the conclusion is here is that first, this is clearly a global issue. It's not an issue of any particular country. We have to go back to 1992. It was in 1992, we should remind ourselves that this was recognized as a threat. It's 30 years ago, and here we are still talking about it. Here we are with COVID just passed. I hesitate to say just passed. I think we have declared that too soon. But anyway, with COVID in the middle, that has only worsened the situation. It's 30 years that have passed. So it's time for deeds, not words. And I think we need to raise our words, our voices about this. But what is very important, we need to cast our votes in a manner that really brings representation to the legislative bodies so that we can then say there will be enough consideration of laws on gender-based violence, but many other issues that have a gender perspective. To me, if we address that, and we address that in every single country, that we bring it up here across First Avenue, and we push for that, and we push back when people tell us this should not be considered, and we push back when people say multilateralism is not worth it, then we will be able to make progress. We can only do that, I'm so thrilled to see so many young women here, if you take it in your hands. And that's why we want to hear from you, and again, want to be absolutely precise that only through the enactment of right laws that then are followed through, this will make a difference.
Thank you so much. That was quite a lot of ground I asked you to cover in 5 minutes. Thank you. It was really incredible. Now I'd like to turn to you, Ms. Serour, and ask for your thoughts on the causes, manifestations, and magnitude of sexual violence against women. I'm sorry, this is a very long question. As a weapon of war, and how to ensure that norms and legal frameworks are fully implemented to counter impunity and foster prevention, redress, and non-repetition.
So if the question, excuse me, if the question is that long, so I can speak longer. Excuse me. Thank you very much. It's a highly charged question, and we know that. We also know that violence against women today is everywhere. Susana was speaking about 30 years of whatever. I would say we have even more issues today. And there are many, many reasons. One of them, of course, is COVID, which has increased that. But speaking about what happens in the field, in conflict, I'd like first to say, when we speak about gender-based violence, we think about 2 C's, coercion, control. I will add another C, which is cowardice, in the sense that somebody who violates somebody else basically does it because they fall prey on people they think they are vulnerable, or they are minority groups. So to me, when I speak about gender-based violence, I think 3 C's: coercion, control, and cowardice, which is one of the causes. You know, when you feel powerful because somebody looks very vulnerable, that's what happens. For me, the manifestation of violence against women, sexual violence against women and the conflict, is ultimately about breaking people's fighting spirit, emotionally, physically, etc. It's about reducing the self-respect. It's about reducing a sense of human dignity. It humiliates and dehumanizes. And I speak from experience in the field. Among the women that we've seen being violated, and children, let us not forget children, it happens. You see that sense of withdrawing because you're being violated. And I think it breaks the fighting spirit. Why? When a man sees his wife or his daughter or his mother being raped in front of him, he withdraws because it's a shame not to be able to protect your family. And I think that's one of the manifestations. Why does it happen? I say power and a sense of impunity makes a lethal combination. Why do I speak about power? In the field, what we've seen is that the very people who are put there to protect are the ones who actually violate women and children. And so with my uniform, I feel I can do it. But they do it because there is impunity. The system itself is not designed well enough to protect, not just to protect, to preempt, to prevent, to pretend, to protect, and to sanction. It is the sanction aspect. And that's why it's happening. And we saw that 2 or 3 years ago, some very disturbing fact that there were instances of sexual violence in conflict zone by peacekeepers, sometimes aid workers or people in the aid industry. I'm sorry, I shouldn't speak about that because I'm part of that system. And I think that's very, very important for us to look at the reality, not to say we are sort of above and they are not above the law. So those for me are realities we cannot forget, and we cannot do this about that. How do we fight impunity is the issue, really. And that to me is an issue of leadership. That if amongst my peacekeepers, for instance, say it's not just the peacekeepers, I have that, I need to take action. And I remember I give an example when I was my last appointment for the UN in Somalia. We had issues, and we put mechanisms in place to fight it, to fight within our own system of the UN. I have to be very frank, and outside. And outside, amongst a few things that we did, was to work very, very closely with the general leading the AMISOM peacekeepers. Because it was important to basically gain his support, have him as an ally and to start saying, listen, there are resolutions, there are laws, and we have to work on that. We established that relationship whereby every time he was going to put his order to lead action against Al-Shabaab, we sit together and we say, in that order, you have to have 2 sentences, one about protection of women, one about protection of children. And we went through that. It was a small gesture, but it was very important. It became almost automatic, whereby every time he was going to launch a new order for a new area, we would sit together and do that. It's not enough, but it's the beginning. Within the mission, we created a working group that had AMISOM representative, that had SPONSOM representative, and we agreed on SOPs, whereby we were co-chairing, myself and the AMISOM leader. We agreed on the kind of sanctions, really. And the sanctions were basically to go back to the origin where we source the peacekeepers. And to say, we work with the Burundian government or the Ugandan or whoever, and to say there should be a very strict identification, selection, and vetting before you send people there. There are a lot of things that could be done, but they are not always done. And to me, if really we want, I won't say eradicate, I'd like to eradicate, but progress towards eradication, we have to be frank amongst ourselves as leaders about the fact that we are accountable, all of us. It's individual and collective responsibility to basically work towards addressing the issue. And that requires, and you said it, Susana, requires strong, sound, unwavering leadership. Not leadership that talks, then goes home, and probably beats the wife, you never know. But a leadership that means what they say, that walks the talk. I'll stop here. I'm sure we'll have more opportunities.
Thank you so much. Again, an extremely difficult task to respond to that enormous question in 5 minutes, so thank you so much. Now, Ms. Verveer, I'd like to ask you, how can we ensure that women participate meaningfully in peace building, conflict prevention, peace negotiations, mediation, and reconciliation processes?
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure for me to be with our global women leaders here, with all of you, and I am impressed to see future leaders sitting in these chairs. And thank you to the Ford Foundation, because you don't just talk the talk, you walk the walk on these issues, so thank you. The question has to do with how do we ensure participation? And you might think, well, why do we need to ensure women's participation in peace building, conflict prevention, transitioning from conflict to hopefully sustainable peace? It's because we're not doing a very good job at it. And it comes again to, I think, the failure of leadership and political will. There is a framework, many of you may be familiar with it, called 1325. It goes by the numbers, and there have been many resolutions in addition to the first one, 1325. But what the United Nations did was acknowledge that women's participation was critical in these areas. And it really developed, there are 4 pillars to the framework, but 2 really are what it's all about. One pillar acknowledges that women experience conflict differently. The other, and therefore need to be protected for all the reasons you just heard, given what goes on in conflict. And today, whether we look at Ukraine or Afghanistan, whether we look at Ethiopia or so many places in between, conflict-related violence against women is an enormous part of these armed situations. So protecting women and prevention is part of that, protection is part of it, and so is prosecution, doing something about it. And we need to do a better job, clearly. The other major piece of this is acknowledging that women are agents, that they're leaders, that they have capacity, that they can make a difference in this space. And we have an evidence-based case for that in the situations where we have seen significant participation. But largely, I think the goal of 1325 is still untapped because we have not really, for all the reasons that you've heard, tapped that leadership that women represent. And what do women do when they are part of this process of engaging in peace building? We find, and it is a data-driven case, that peace agreements are far more sustainable. They last longer. That the significant issues are addressed. Women bring issues to the table that ordinarily don't get to the table. So imagine today, which is the reality, that very few women are meaningfully engaged in peace talks or signatories to peace agreements. And yet we know what they bring to the table is issues of reconciliation, forging reconciliation, putting economic opportunity on the table, which is critical post-conflict, bringing human rights and justice to the table, which often aren't there, forging compromises, bringing people together, asking who's not at the table, ensuring that the marginalized are part of the solution. So really critical aspects of women's leadership are significantly missing in this space. And, you know, I have a friend who was sent to Angola. He later became ambassador. He wasn't a gender expert, and he was told to observe the peace process. And he went in and saw this big table, nothing but men on both sides of the table. The military on one side, the armed combatants on the other side. And he said the first thing they did when their discussions began was to give themselves amnesty for what they had done to the women. So it wasn't a matter of taking these issues and putting them on the table and addressing them. It was not paying any attention to them. And he said he learned a really significant lesson because as he spent time there, saw what came out of an agreement, that agreement didn't last long at all. The men had put together a big demining program because mines were everywhere, killing people. They never factored in the fact that women were in the fields growing the food that was going to sustain the livelihoods of the people in the country. So many mistakes were made, so many issues that needed to be addressed weren't addressed. And later, as ambassador, he found himself with a peace agreement that failed because he was back a couple years later, and the need to start all over. So this is a really critical question. So where is the solution today? What can we do about this? There are some, I think, positive steps that need to grow. There's something called Track 2 that you may be familiar with. Track 1 are these negotiations that are at the formal level, the official level, really important, driving some sort of agreement. Whether or not in the end it's a good agreement or not depends on who's at the table. But Track 2 or Track 3 is what's happening on the ground. And this is going on every day in all of these areas where women largely are doing local mediation. They're doing dialogue facilitation. They're addressing humanitarian crises. They know what's happening, what's caused it, what needs to be done. And the problem is that what's happening in this robust peace building at the grassroots level is not connected to the discussions in the Track 1 level. And that's where we have to work to close the gap and persuade leaders that they need to listen. And I was at a peace forum pre-COVID, just before COVID, and the Secretary General said, oh, we've got all of these conflicts that have absorbed the world, and we've got to do a better job at peace building. And he said, maybe we've got to find a way to have more happen at the local level. And all the women sitting in the room basically said, it's happening at the local level. It's just not connected to where the big conversation is, which is going to have the real impact. So that's clearly one place we need to make a better difference. The other thing that's been happening, largely through women's leadership, I might add, is mediation networks that have been created, starting with the Nordics, the Mediterranean now, the Africa region, moving to Asia, but creating these networks of women mediators who can be unleashed at the local level as experts, but also, hopefully, to the official level. Acknowledging, one of the things you hear at the UN and other places is, well, women don't know how to do this. There are no female negotiators who really are experts at this. And it's this constant put down without making any effort to identify them. So besides really working and training and ensuring that lots of women mediators with the talent and the skills are available, and bringing that bottom level and top level together. And that's what we really need to do. There's an old saying I was told in Indonesia, which is to make a pancake, you need heat at the top and you need heat at the bottom. We have some heat at the bottom that's rather significant. We don't have the heat at the top that we need in many instances, and somehow we have to meld the two. So I think that's one critical, or two critical ways that we really need to engage. And we need to make sure that when UN envoys are assigned, and you were a deputy in Afghanistan back when, that they go with this mandate from 1325. Often they will go and tell you or speak publicly that women really don't have a role in this. So we have to make the international institution function better. And then there's the whole area of national action plans. There are almost 100 national action plans today on women, peace, and security. Some are terrific. They're really affecting their government decision making. Some are check the box. But they are an important tool. And that, along with a new development that you may or may not have heard about, called feminist foreign policy, is really an attempt to integrate gender issues across foreign policy. So one of the critical ways to engage successfully is to take the power, the political power, that resides in our diplomatic efforts from all of the countries of the world, some very, very significant compared to others who may be mired in conflict, and to ensure that in our diplomacy these issues are being raised and they're being factored in. And I would say today, a government can have a national action plan, it can even have a feminist foreign policy, but you would never know it by their diplomatic work in this space. So I think that's an area where there is development, but it is far from where it needs to be. And then what is working? Well, I think we have several examples of peace processes that have worked. I will just throw out what happened in Colombia after 50 years of conflict, after a women's summit for peace that was recognized by the UN and the government there. A process was put in place that enabled the women who were largely victimized by what was happening during these decades of conflict to bring their experience and have it acknowledged, to really say that there would be no amnesty, no impunity, unless it was really discussed in a process that was set up on violence against women in the conflict. There was the first ever gender commission established for this process, that the voices of women and their experiences and their leadership would be at every step. And where it is today is the previous government that just left office was really not favorably disposed to this peace agreement, so hardly anything happened after all those years of effort. We've seen it in the Philippines, we saw it years ago in Northern Ireland, that when women get to the peace table, they can have tremendous impact in a way that will sustain that peace, make it durable, and that happens because the real issues are discussed. I will stop there, except to say one more thing, if I may, and that is at the university where I am at Georgetown. We put out a index. It's called the Women, Peace, and Security Index. And what it does is look at the well-being of women in 170 countries based on not just inclusion, which is important, political participation, economic participation, but justice, levels of discrimination, and violence. Are you safe in your home? Are you safe in your community? What's the story about what's happening in the conflicts, security at large? And why is it important? Because what we now know, if we didn't before, is that the well-being of women and the well-being of a nation goes hand in hand. Where women are prospering, those nations are not mired in instability, conflict, and worse. But where the opposite is the case, you have the problem we're discussing today, gender-based violence and conflict-related sexual violence. So it's really important that we invest, as Susana made the point early on. It's about a bigger issue, which is the well-being of women, gender equality, and women's empowerment.
Thank you so much. Can I just take a moment to say I'm so impressed by the ease that all of you have condensed decades worth of experience and knowledge into only a few minute answers. So thank you so much. It's such an honor to hear from you and to be up here with you. So now, last but not least, Ms. Masakiza, I'd like to ask you, what strategies, policies, and norms should the multilateral system improve and or reform to address gender-based violence from an intersectional approach?
Thanks for the invitation. First of all, for me it's an honor to be sitting with so extraordinary women, and of course in Ford Foundation, and seeing you all, and I think it's really meaningful because I believe this is an opportunity for us to listen to each other. And as our young moderator say, my name is Miriam Masakiza and I am Quichua Salasaca from Ecuador, and I have the privilege to be support the work in three fronts, if I would say. As an indigenous activist, I was also working with the government as an advisor and a diplomat in Ecuador, and currently as a staff member of the United Nations Secretariat. So why I am telling you these things very briefly? It is because I am the result of indigenous sisters and brothers' leadership and vision, and that's why I am sitting here. So that's, I think, very important to acknowledge, and otherwise, you know, I wouldn't be here, or other indigenous peoples wouldn't be talking in these important forums. And the allies are also the ones who provided all the support to us at the beginning, you know, and now I feel that we have our own voice, and that's why I am here, so thank you very much again. And As probably you know, of course, and probably Ms. Malcorra, I was just telling her that every time that I saw in the corridors of the UN, I used to run after her and I just say, indigenous women, don't forget indigenous women. and you know, and I have here also a colleague of mine, she knows how I am. So I think that is very, very important. Why? Because another friend of mine just used to tell me, it is because you are the flyer, the alive flyer of indigenous peoples at the UN. And I believe it is sometimes true, but now I would like to regret that, unfortunately, Secretary General doesn't have us all the time in front talking about indigenous people's issues. But in any case, I think the leadership of women like you talking about these important issues, but especially talking about the left out sector group, which is indigenous peoples, indigenous women, is really important. Why? Because even though indigenous women and girls are key players, have a key role in their communities. They are, they keep our cultures, they transmit our languages. We are forget, not only in the community level, but also outside. And we are discriminated, not only in our community again, but also we are discriminated in rural and also in urban areas. And this is really hard. Hard for us because to have this self-esteem of who we are, it is really important wherever we are. So I think the gender-based violence is adversely affecting the lives of many indigenous women. Environmental violence, of course. Indigenous women also suffer domestic violence. They are used for trafficking. Indigenous children are also recruited many times with the paramilitary forces, of course. And nowadays also there are contemporary ways of slavery, which is also, something that unfortunately is forgotten and we don't talk about that. But in order to respond to these diverse forms of violence against indigenous women, indigenous women leaders for around the world, they come together and they establish a very important forum, the International Indigenous Women Forum, FINI. This, in order to, again, leadership, to strategize, have the vision on how they would like to bring these talks, not only at the local level, but also to the international level. So, before I move to other issues, let me recognize Monica Aleman, because she has done a wonderful work. She was the executive director and founder of FIMI, and she's one of the leaders that was putting together this important forum. And one of the strategies was the preparation of the companion report of the Secretary General on violence against indigenous women, entitled Mayrin Iwanka Raya. This report was done in a very timely way because here it was the possibility to read and find together from all parts of the world the vision and strategies by indigenous women on how to confront, on how to try to eradicate violence against indigenous women. This report certainly demonstrates that violations against indigenous peoples, the collective rights of indigenous peoples, affect also the individual rights of indigenous women. So this is something that we cannot separate. And of course, as I said, not every day I have the opportunity to be sitting with so extraordinary women, and of course, you here as an audience. So let me just very briefly walk you through of these extraordinary, how can I say, achievements, milestones, at least for the indigenous women movement here at the UN, but also in the international processes. Indigenous women participated in the deliberations of the establishment of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. They were also participating in all the negotiations when the process of the drafting of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that was adopted in 2007. This past Tuesday, we just commemorated 15 years. Indigenous women participated in the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples in 2014 through lots of negotiation, but also again, leadership, an indigenous person, an indigenous appointed person, advisor by the PTA. We have also mentions, paragraphs specifically talking about violence against indigenous women, empowerment, access to education, access to justice. So I think this is really important that we cannot forget. At the Commission of the Status of Women, I recall, I think I started in 2003, but immediately in 2005 and later in 2012, we got for the first time 2 resolutions related specifically to indigenous women. Later in 2013, the CSW also focused on the priority theme, elimination and prevention of all forms of violence against women and girls, and adopted a set of agreed conclusions. Since then, indigenous women are always present in these agreed conclusions. In 2007, during the 61st session of the CSW, an interactive dialogue was held on the empowerment of indigenous women. Could you imagine? That was a dream come true, really. It was the first time that indigenous women have been discussed as a stand-alone topic in this official meeting of the CSW. That was really amazing, and I was very happy about that. Despite of the existence of all these instruments, the special needs of indigenous women still, forget by states and also, if I would say, the multilateral system. However, I think it is really important to think on how we should connect each other. And that's why we're trying to talk, even though the Secretary General also, indigenous peoples were already talking about this new social contract. But when we were saying those kind of terms, nobody paid attention to us. But immediately when a man and a Secretary General mentioned, that was, of course, it was in the agenda. So, what else I can say? So, you can understand. But to conclude, I would like to tell you, dear friends, colleagues, that we need your support. We need your solidarity. Because definitely, indigenous peoples can't choose their own lives. Continue speaking our indigenous languages, manage our own education system or health systems, unless we manage our lands and territories. And again, gender-based, violence, it's an issue that needs to be talked more within our communities, but outside too. And I hope that you, of course, after this talk, we can continue the discussion and then jump to another step, which is do this. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Some common threads, but really a very wide range of responses that I think forms a really comprehensive sort of, like almost a playbook for policymakers, civil society, and activists alike, from electing strong women to all levels of government, to sanctioning gender-based violence, making sure women have a seat at the table, and making sure that we're also prioritizing the rights and quality of life of indigenous women. Just for time, I think we should move right into Q&A now. So I'd like to open the room to all audience members for the next 25 or so minutes for any questions you have. So once you're called on, please just tell us your name and where you work or why you've decided to attend this event. Thank you. Please. Yes.
Use the mic. Use the mic, please.
My name is Elizabeth, and Elizabeth G. Barapataglia. And coming here today is just the opportunity to meet all professionals and my colleagues. And my question to you all before I can start, I just want to say thanks to all the professionals that lay off the opportunity to tell us the how what you guys been doing for the national women and international, both local. I just want to say thank you. My question to you all here is because I just came from Liberia and I opened an institute in Monrovia, Liberia through my home Abbey with traditional guys. I started from 2 bedrooms and now, praise God, I have a huge building. And when you say women being abused, disadvantaged women, these are the kind of women I am educating in Liberia. I live in America for the past 18 years. But I've been living from paycheck to paycheck and trying to do the best for guys and women in Liberia. And my question to you all here is, first of all, I want to say thank you again. But what we can do to improve those of us that are taking care of disadvantaged women around the globe on a not-profit level, what help do you think we can able to get from the international community? Because many of my guys been raped and they have children and they can't esteem themselves. And I'm taking the initiative, taking care of them, taking care of their children, taking care of the institution I'm running. So this question forward to you. What you think we can do to make our government to pay attention to such school I am running, for example, because it's not Ireland, it's around the globe. Many women are taking care of girls, disadvantaged girls. They are in slavery. We're trying to bring them back home for them to be responsible for themselves. What empowerment United Nations can give us through our government to improve these girls and their children's lives?
Let me start. I'm sure colleagues will have additional views. First of all, I think you have here from us different angles on this issue. I want to point out Miriam at the end, who she talked about roots, connecting roots to the top, as Melanne indicated. That connection is fundamental. And the examples she gave show that there are opportunities to make those connections, that there are instances that really make those connections work. For me, and I'm biased here because I deeply believe in the value of the United Nations. With all its failures, with all its problems, I deeply believe in the United Nations. For me, the CSW process is fundamental. It's the place where people are called to task, where governments come together and need to recognize whether they have made improvements or they have gone backwards. And let me tell you, we are losing ground big time there. We have been losing ground
for the past 10 years, I would say. So when you talk about how the international system can help you at the ground level, making clear to the government what is that the government should be doing, that is the established procedure. And sorry about talking about procedures, it sounds meaningless, but in the end, you need to find ways to bring people together to establish standards, norms that then you measure governments against. So clearly, there is a concerted effort to debilitate all processes related to women, particularly CSW, and I will say we have to push back, because if we lose that, then we lose all opportunity to make this really what it needs to be done. And we are at the brink of losing it. So to me, that is at the center. Make sure that we go for what is established through CSW, and our voices are loud and clear, and we put pressure on our governments to really come forward.
Thank you.
So
After you.
first of all, let me thank you on behalf of all of us for what you're doing, because it, in the end, is what makes the real difference. You're doing that hard work on the ground. And when I think of Liberia, I think of what the women of Liberia did to bring peace to Liberia. It came out of a mass protest by the women who spoke truth to power, surrounded the dictator in charge and said, you go to the peace process and you bring us peace, we've had enough violence. And then they all surrounded those peace discussions and would not let the men out until they actually achieved an agreement. So the common denominator in all of that is organization and people power. And I think if we say anything 1,000 times a day, it's that we must fund women's organizations on the ground, that they are vital, vital players. And I think perhaps one way is for you and others like you who are laboring so hard in Liberia to come together as a cohesive coalition and put an agenda together on what your needs are, and begin, hopefully through private, foundational, governmental sources, get the kind of support you need. But I think you need to come together in a way that would move your work forward in a collective, the way others need the same thing. It's very hard by yourself.
But I need your support because I have the video to show you where I started the school from and what I'm going now. Because I live in America, but I did it from paycheck to paycheck. And I'm very proud of this country to give me skills, and I was able to share the skills with Liberia. And first of all, I want to say thanks to you all, because you all brought me in this country as a refugees. And I one of those that brought peace in Liberia during the All Liberian Conference. You can see me at the Hotel Africa. And I mobilized the market women, and we try hard to take charter from in the bush to bring him in the city, because that was the only solution to get him over where he is now. But to call all matter short, I was brought in this country by you all. And luckily for me, you gave me skills, and I decided the skills to take it back. And through that, I can show you what I've been doing for the girls, and I still need your help, because it's a huge building, size like this building. And I alone cannot run it. I need your help. So if you want to see the video, I won't mind.
And I think maybe we should do it afterwards, because otherwise,
It will be very hard with the technology for us to try to set it up right now.
yeah.
We'll have some beverages and some snacks afterwards. I think that's a good time.
Yeah.
All right.
Let's have another question maybe.
Okay. Thank you.
Maybe take them at a time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Should we take off?
Okay.
Hi, my name's Hannah, and I'm a fellow at Outright Action International. It's such a privilege to be here with you. Thank you very much for your extremely insightful remarks. I wanted to ask you about your thoughts on the inclusion and participation of lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and queer women in legislatures, in leadership positions in conflict settings, in negotiation tables for peace processes, in Indigenous activism. What do you think is the importance and the impact of having those queer voices at the table kind of among women in our collective struggle against GBV? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Gemma. I have the privilege to work with Miriam in the UN Secretariat. And I just want to say thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to hear all of these accomplished women be in your presence, really. But I can't help notice that in this room there's a little bit of a gender imbalance. And I just wanted to hear your thoughts a little bit on this. Where are the feminist men, and how do we engage with one? Where are the rest of them? And just to ask your thoughts. How do we engage men in this kind of the things that you're trying to do in achieving women's empowerment and women's leadership? How do we include men in these conversations, which they should also be?
So my name's Stephanie Lord, and I am here representing Angelique Kijo's Fatanga Foundation, and we focus on supporting and empowering adolescent girls and young women with skills. And one of the things that we're working on currently is redesigning completely our curriculum for our adolescent girls leadership clubs. And as we think about this, I'm just wondering if you have any input on specific topics and skills that that we should absolutely include in a curriculum for our adolescent young women to prepare them for the type of meaningful engagement that you've spoken about today. So thank you so much.
My name is Wenceslas. I'm working for Batanga as well. I'm in charge of engaging men and boys, a total new portfolio at Batanga Foundation. Thank you for all your efforts to push forward this work, this fight. You mentioned during your speech that having women in parliament is more effective to have them within the executive. I'm from Benin, a French-speaking country in West Africa, and sometimes the government, the executive, the presidents are not allowing women to reach the parliament, even though there are many movements who are pushing forward to push them within the parliament. Is not the case. What do you think is more effective as strategies to allow women to reach this important position for our work? You mentioned that you have 61 members within the women, your association, the Global Women Leaders. I'm curious and I'm wondering if there are members coming from the French-speaking country, because sometimes they are left behind, so that the movement is not the same within the English-speaking countries as the French-speaking country. And in terms of including men and boys to this fight, I'm an example. I'm totally feminist. I'm working for this. After doing this work with Batanga for 6 years, we noticed that the piece that that we need to improve to have more impact within our work is to more engage men and boys to our work. By giving an example, we are empowering women to lead their own businesses. We noticed that other many process evaluation of processes, we noticed that the women who have their husband supporting their businesses succeeding more than the one who do not have their husband behind their business. So we launched this new portfolio to strategize, to identify more tools, new tools, to more engage them for the about 6,000 adolescent girls and young women we are serving in Benin. I need to mention that our big focus is the women and the adolescent girls in rural area in Benin. We are also launching our programs in Senegal because of the success we have in Benin. Thank you.
I think very briefly, Felicia. I cannot leave you out.
Thank you. I'll be very, very fast. Felicia Penting, I am the Vice President of the Center of Gender Excellence at the International Center for Research on Women. First of all, just really wonderful panel, so thoughtful, very happy to be here. My question for all of you is really around justice frameworks for gender-based violence. I think that we all sort of understand how confronting violence with state violence oftentimes does not really lead to really wonderful outcomes. I'm curious to know your sort of thoughts on that from the sort of top of the heap pancake and the bottom of the heap pancake.
If I may chip in here, Melanne needs to leave on time, so why don't I give you the floor? Sorry to intervene as the moderator. But I committed to her, who has to go back to DC, that she will leave on time. So
But I won't
you
miss
go
the
first.
last train.
Yeah, you go first, Melanne, and then you can leave, and we give you a big round of applause.
I'm okay for a while, so
Okay,
you don't have
okay.
to push me out quite so
No,
quickly.
I just want to make sure that I don't keep you longer. Go ahead.
There's been so many good questions, so I'll just zero in on a couple. I think Men Engaged is so critically important. So often when I speak to women, and GBV is the topic, what they all say is, why are you talking to us? The problem is the men. And really, men have to be critical allies in this. And I think fundamentally, the big problem in this area are norms. Deeply entrenched practices, biases, attitudes, they keep all the kinds of things from happening that we know need to happen, and we can't do it alone. And so I think programs like the ones you were describing, I've seen many. I remember being in Zambia at one point where the whole process to address GBV was a holistic process that not only addressed all aspects from protection to prosecution, but brought the men in who were equally engaged in what was happening and talking about their own experiences and what it was like to proselytize other men. So I think this work is very important. There's not enough of it. And just a very quick story. I was in India several years ago announcing a US program to deal with GBV, and it was to support men. They were all illiterate, and they were from a village, and they were using skits to get across the fact that you don't abuse women. So, you know, they were doing the skit in front of me, and when the arm of one went down to strike, which was clearly, it was all men, but to strike a woman who was playing that role, somebody else moved the arm back up. And the leader of this program got in touch with me a year or so later, and she said, the men want to know when you're coming back to India because they want to talk to you. And I thought, oh my God, this probably hasn't worked out. And so when I went back, I said, so what do you want to tell me? I said, has violence against women gone down in the village? Oh, yes, 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 very successful, down. No big problems like we had. I said, so what do you want to tell me? They said, we want to tell you that we have changed. We no longer think that our life is about allowing women to be abused. That's not our attitude anymore. We've changed. And they wanted to say they were liberated. They were freed up from what was imposed on them in their way of life. And so I think we want to get to that point where norms like that are no longer. So maybe I'll just stop with that one. You all come in and I'll come back on some others. Fatiha?
Thank you, Susana. Thank you. I think very good questions, and I wish we had more time. So let me maybe pick up on 2 or 3. Number one, very important. I think when we talk about inclusion and inclusivity, there is no other definition that everybody, regardless, and I'm sorry to put it that way, of color, origin, social status, civil status, but also sexual orientation. So, and we believe in that, and we all fight for that. Everyone has the right to be included and to participate and to contribute. So for me, anybody who would ask me the question, I say, of course. It is, of course. So in our group, this is what we believe in, and we fight for as well. And the fight will continue. But there are great achievements today, I think, in terms of inclusivity. So I hope this helps at least address the question. I'd like to come back to my friend from Benin. And yes, we have French speakers.
On peut parler français.
On peut parler français, il n'y a pas de problème, ou arabe, comme vous voulez. But in the GWL, we have speakers of English, Arabic, Spanish, and French. And I come from
Chinese.
Chinese, I'm sorry. And I come from North Africa. And throughout my career in development, I always fought to ensure that there is Francophone, Anglophone, and now we push for Lusophone, right? So that's very, very important. But I wanted to come back to the question of the president or the leader of Benin who doesn't want women in parliament. I don't know really the details, but for me, 3 things come to my mind. Number one, if they are elected, if women are elected through a normal electoral process, they have the right to be in parliament. Okay, that's one. Of course, sometimes in our governments, I'm speaking about my country, Algeria, I know it's not always easy. The second point is really, as you said, is to build coalition. The strongest movement that have effected change everywhere in the world are social pressure movements. They don't come from the top, they come from here, right? And I think building coalition to basically call for the right to be in parliament is extremely important. The third point is about responsible citizenship. In other words, I vote for you, I want you to defend my point of view in parliament. So I choose who I vote for so that that person becomes my voice, the voice of my group. That's extremely important. In other words, we come back to the origin of how to prepare our society for responsible citizenship, whereby you vote for the people who will defend your case. And it's a struggle, but it happens, and it leads to results, and those would be some of the elements. I'll stop here so that my colleagues have more time.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to recommend maybe something. It is really important, to talk first of all, to engage, but also to look at good examples. In the case of indigenous peoples, for example, we always try to look how women movement start, going step by step on this process. So that's a kind of the good example that we follow. And at the UN, for example, because there is an interagency group on gender equality, YANGWE, at the UN also we established the interagency support group on indigenous people's issues. So, always I think it's really important because they already know the strategies, the ways how to walk within these strange processes. I think it's always important to do that. I remember that the peasants, for example, they came to the UN when at that time I was the office of the PGA with Father Miguel Descoto. They were like asking, how can we start the process of the Declaration on the Rights of Peasants? And then Father Miguel asked me to come, and I was like, okay, tell them how indigenous peoples did walk through that. So I was telling them, and then I was very surprised that maybe 4 years ago they already have this declaration. See, I think it's really important to do these kind of things because that will really help you to instead of going all around, just already know what strategies to follow up. And I think a very important issue was asked about topics for the programs that you would like to do. I think number one would be diversity, to learn about diversity. Because sometimes we are afraid of this diversity. And I think this is really important that we all should know. I have a kind of teenager now, and I am a little bit concerned because she's here in this country, but she always say that she's a Quechua from Brooklyn because she born in Brooklyn. But again, it is really difficult, and I am trying to think also. In the school today was a PTA is called. I am still learning about these issues. And then I was like trying to think, okay, what I want for Amaya is the name of my daughter. And I think this is a very important issue that also, again, we can discuss more, but it would be good examples also. And when you say, I think this foundation or something, that you are spending some funds in order to empower young people, I just want to give you an example. In Ecuador, I am also a product of a foundation from Germany who spent some funds with indigenous students in universities. So I believe they were like thinking how we are going to spend the money. And then they just saw some indigenous people walking in the streets, and they asked them, come. What are you doing here in the city? And then they were saying that, well, we are looking for a job, And then this guy, of course, he passed away, Arnie Schlegel. He said, but why you are not studying? Because you are too young, you should be studying. And they said, well, we don't have money. How we can manage to go and study? And then he said, okay, we will fund you. We will give you some funds so you can survive. And then he started with 10 indigenous people from the south, from Saraguros. They are in the south. And they managed to go into the university to become teachers. And then after that, he thought, okay, these indigenous peoples, I believe they have a future. They have, something to offer. Then he decided to establish a fellowship program. And then from that product, we are around 300 indigenous youth now. And it's really amazing because some of them are lawyers, some of them are teachers, some of them are congresswomen, congress ministers, former ministers. And I am also one of that little piece of support. So that's why it's really important, the support of you. And that's why I am calling you again, the solidarity of humanity to have this, of course, first of all. Thank you.
I'm going to start correcting Miriam. She's not the product of that. She's the product of her strength, her conviction, her leadership. Of course, she was given an opportunity, and that is very important. But to me, going to your point on curriculum, you need to go into this notion of the self-esteem that should be at the center of what girls understand to build themselves a better future. Self-esteem is, for me, absolutely essential. And I have no doubt that the Germans did great with her. But I have also, I'm sure that there was a seed there that was based on her own self-esteem. So that, to me, should be at the center. When we talk about leadership, self-esteem is a prerequisite for that, you know, particularly with women. And let's not forget that all this discussion is a discussion about power. You know, we tend to not use the word power when we talk about women and women's space. So in order to fight for your share of power, you need that self-esteem. And on top of that, and this will be another discussion, we need to understand that there should be no fight for power if you thought that this was not a zero-sum game, that there was a win-win. But men don't get it that way most of the time, particularly men in power. Women in parliament, the one thing I deeply believe in is quotas. I used to be convinced when I was young, that's very, very long ago, that, you know, your own doing, your merits were enough. And life taught me that that is maybe necessary, but not enough. So quota systems are absolutely essential. Affirmative action policies are absolutely essential in terms of parliaments, but in terms of anything where you want to increase the participation of women. You know, women in boards in the private sector. I mean, you need to set up a quotas. And I hear people say, well, then not necessarily the best get there, you know. Well, not the best men get to where they are. So give me a break. Just give me a break. So that, to me, is a very essential piece. Talking about our group, we are 61 and counting, 40 countries, all regions of the world. We have all languages, and in fact, we issue documentation, at least in English and French, much in Spanish and Arabic, and some in Chinese. So we try to stay true to the spirit of the United Nations. Of course, we don't have the resources to do all of this every time, but for certain messages, we do it. On justice frameworks, I go back to my point at the beginning on policies that are designed to really take into account not only gender-based violence, but women empowerment at large. But not only to enact the policies, but to follow through. Follow through for me is the summary of justice frameworks. And that is absolutely essential. There are good examples, which I think we should use as benchmarks to compare against and to transmit to new implementations throughout the world, in my part of the world, Latin America, in Africa. So that should be the approach. If you don't close the loop, you never get there. And that's one problem, one risk, that we tick the box that yes, the policy has been passed, and we leave it there. We just need to call people to account and to make sure that they deliver. So that is at the center. And it goes without saying that we talk minorities, we talk access for everyone. But it's also true that we believe that half the population of the world is not having access as it should. So we need to bear that in mind. So that would be my summary. I don't know.
But if I may, just on that point, and I had it as a note to speak about, which is the true meaning of SDG 16, right? The accountability, the effectiveness, the inclusivity. In other words, for truly justice system that serve the purpose of the people, men and women, but we're speaking about gender-based violence, so we're speaking about women, is really, for me, I cannot see it any other way than putting survivors in the center of those decisions for justice to really take place, be effective, you see the results. They have to be part of the policy, the process. They have to hold the people they elect accountable. And for that, again, we go back to the importance of leadership, real leadership of justice institutions. And that is what is important. In terms of conflict, I always speak about transitional justice as well. The end of a conflict doesn't mean that justice has been served. The end of the conflict is the beginning of building actually peaceful societies and ensuring that people get justice for whatever happened to them. I always go back to SDG 16. It's not there for nothing. The words have been chosen very well. But now the action has to be equally good, if not better.
And it was hard fought.
I know, I know, I know.
Okay, I think with that, the Q&A section of the panel has concluded. Thank you to the audience for the questions that show not only really deep and meaningful engagement with all the speakers in the panel, but also the urgency and immediacy of the conversation. So thank you to each of you for your dedication to women and girls around the world and to this conversation. And of course, an enormous thank you to the speakers. The four of you are beacons of hope for my generation and what we can accomplish if we fight the way you all have and continue to. I've personally learned an enormous amount during this conversation, and I'm excited to take what I've learned forward and advance the conversation in the ways that are available to me. I hope the audience feels the same way. And we'll have some beverages and snacks afterwards. So thank you.